it's important for every farmer now to plan, to know how much silage they need, to get the fertiliser out whenever ground conditions allow. But I suppose the key thing here, Catherine, is not to push back the cutting date this year, because pushing back the cutting date will have subsequent cutback on the amount of silage that can be cut from that field during the year. And if you push back the cutting date for the first cut, it means the second cut runs late and potentially maybe even rules out the opportunity for a third cut later when we need to replenish silage stocks in farmyards.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, I'm joined by Teagasc DairyBeef 500 advisor Gordon Peppard to discuss closing for silage and making quality silage. Gordon, you're very welcome. The DairyBeef 500 team recently launched the 10 points that are key to producing high quality silage and reducing winter feed costs on farms.
That's right, Catherine. Look, I suppose on any dairy calf to beef farm, all animals are priority stock, and it's essential that all animals are gaining weight every day that they're on farm. So over a winter period, there's no room for medium or poor quality silage. All the silage really needs to be of a very high standard, and it needs to be of a quality probably in the region of 72, 74 DMD plus. And I suppose, look, all these calf to beef animals over the winter period, we'd need them to be doing an average daily gain roughly in the region of somewhere around 0.7 of a kilo. So I suppose it's very important that we make high quality silage and have it in the yards and available for the winter period on dairy calf to beef farms.
And what's the first step, Gordon, to achieving this 74 DMD silage?
Yeah, so look, I suppose this spring has been a very difficult spring, Catherine. We've had excessive rainfall. We've had a lot of days rain on farms across the whole country. And look, ideally in a normal year, you'd be saying in the spring there that a tight grazing of the silage ground in early to mid-March, followed by slurry and fertiliser application towards the end of March would be the ideal preparation for that. But obviously, this year, that's not going to happen. Silage pits farmers are now at the back wall of the silage pit. Bale stocks have been depleted on many farms. And I suppose it's important that farmers make a plan now as to how they're going to replenish those silage stocks this summer and to make good quality silage and have enough of it for next winter.
And you mentioned there, really, we are after a very difficult spring. In cases where silage ground won't be grazed, as you mentioned, what should farmers consider?
So I suppose in some cases farmers have been lucky and maybe they got out earlier and they did get some of the silage ground grazed. But with the weather we're after having and the rainfall, a lot of ground and silage fields have been just too wet to graze this year. And we're here now on the first week of April, and there's plenty of grass out there. And a lot of these silage fields have a decent cover on them. And a lot of them in many cases won't get grazed at this stage. So we're probably going to have a scenario where there will be no slurry will go out on these fields because of the high levels of grass cover on them. It'll probably be a case of chemical fertiliser will have to go out to meet the N, P and K demands of the crop.
And what fertiliser should farmers be applying then, Gordon?
Yeah, so I suppose if you're just going solely with chemical fertiliser, ideally it would be something like a product like 0730, probably somewhere in the region of 2 to 2.5 bags per acre of that. The big issue you have to look out for there is, do you actually have allowance on your farm to spread chemical P? So that's the first thing you have to look. Is there an allowance on the farm for chemical P? If not, you might have to adjust that P and K recommendation. In general, most years on a traditional grass sward, somewhere in the region of 80 units of nitrogen would be what we'd be looking at for a good first cut of silage. If it was a recently reseeded field or maybe a young perennial ryegrass in the last year or two, it might have taken maybe up to 100 units. But look, this year it's all a bit different. We need to plan backwards. A lot of crops now will need maybe to get less than that to cut it on time. And I suppose the nitrogen of choice will probably be something like protected urea, the 38% nitrogen, which also includes 7% sulfur. Sulfur as a fertilizer is very important as well, and every cut requires somewhere in the region of about 15 units of sulfur to go out.
And most often, Gordon, sometimes the sulfur is a forgotten ingredient on some of the fertiliser programmes.
Absolutely, yeah. It's often the forgotten element, but it's very important, I suppose, to maximize crop yield, and it also makes the use of the nitrogen much more efficient as well.
And for years, we've seen the crop requiring a high amount of potassium. What is the potassium requirement for a crop of silage?
Yeah, so I suppose traditionally, I suppose somewhere between 80 to 100 units per acre of potassium, and that can come from a combination of slurry and fertilizer. So if the traditional method of putting out 2.5 to 3,000 gallons of good quality cattle slurry was to be done this year, that would generally meet the P and K requirements. But unfortunately, this year, in a lot of cases, that slurry is not going to be got out, and it'll have to be made up in the chemical fertilizer form of, as I said, of something like an 0730 or an 01020, something along those lines, providing you have an allowance to spread the chemical P.
Most definitely, Gordon. And weed control is an important factor that's often overlooked in a silage crop. What are the key weeds that farmers need to be aware of and control of them?
Yeah, so look, I suppose docks in particular will have a big impact on yield and quality, and there's other weeds there like chickweed and dandelion, but I suppose in the main, docks are the main weed that we're concerned with looking to control. Like a moderate infestation of docks will drastically hit your yield and your quality, and particularly in bale silage where you have docks, the dock stems can very often puncture the plastic, and this increases the waste of silage. I suppose timing of spraying is then the critical thing. So I suppose 2 or 3 weeks after fertilizer goes out is generally when the dock is at the perfect stage for an effective kill. The dock should be actively growing at that stage, and they should be sprayed a minimum of 3 weeks before the silage is harvested. And this is to allow the chemical time to get down into the root system and to get a good kill. Now, the one thing I suppose that varies from farm to farm is the farming system and the type of grassland swards you have on your farm. So some people may have clover in their swards that they want to protect. So the product that is used, you may need to discuss this with your local agri merchant or your agricultural advisor just to get the product and the timing correct.
That's great, Gordon. And I suppose it's a distant thought on most farms at the moment. But when it comes to harvesting the crop, it can be a very tight line between balancing yield and quality on farms.
That's right. So look, I suppose the important thing is to have a plan this year. Even though the season has run late, I wouldn't be pushing the cutting date back. I'd still be targeting my mid-May cutting date. I think it's probably important then to work back from the mid-May cutting date to decide how much nitrogen you put out. The weather forecast is not great there for the next few days, so it could well be another week or 10 days before fertilizer goes out. The general rule of thumb is you have about 2 units of nitrogen per day. So if we're looking at cutting on the 15th of May and the fertilizer doesn't go out until, say, the 10th of April, that's only 35 days to cutting. So you would be reducing the nitrogen back then to probably somewhere closer to 70 units of nitrogen so that you still meet that cutting date in order to get a good quality and also to get a decent yield.
And you mentioned there, like there is a fear among farmers when it comes to mid-May about there being nitrogen in the crop. How would wilting affect the crop, particularly if there's a fear of nitrogen?
Yeah, so look, I suppose when you come to that mid-May, it shouldn't be all about the nitrogen. If the weather conditions are suitable for cutting, you should test the grass crop for sugars. If the sugars are over 3%, the crop will generally ensile quite good. The higher sugar content allows for the crop to ferment quickly and reduce the pH, which will help preserve the crop. If it's somewhere between 2 and 3, wilting will be of benefit. And I suppose the ideal wilt, depending on the weather, if it's very dry, 24 hours is probably plenty. If it's a little bit more dull and overcast, somewhere between 24 and 36 hours is probably the length of wilt.
And you mentioned there the importance, Gordon, of planning now. And as you mentioned, a lot of the farmers in the programme really need to be making top quality silage, particularly for stock that's on the farms for either weaning stage or finishing stage. In regard to farmers that would have suckler cows, where would they plan with regard to making quality silage for weanings and finishing stock versus maybe poor quality silage for suckler cows?
Yeah, so I suppose, look, it's the finishing and growing animals that need the higher quality silage that they're moving forward and gaining weight every day they're on farm. Maybe with a suckler cow in good condition, you can sacrifice maybe a little bit less on quality of silage. But I suppose in the main, the aim is to make good quality silage, make plenty of it. And I suppose it's important for every farmer now to plan, to know how much silage they need, to get the fertilizer out whenever ground conditions allow. But I suppose the key thing here, Catherine, is not to push back the cutting date this year, because pushing back the cutting date will have subsequent cut back on the amount of silage that can be cut from that field during the year. And if you push back the cutting date for the first cut, it means the second cut runs late and potentially maybe even rules out the opportunity for a third cut later when we need to replenish silage stocks in farmyards.
Gordon, in some cases farmers think that bulking up the first cut will have some benefits, but in most cases they'll end up feeding more concentrates next winter because of the poor quality silage that's actually being made.
That's right, and what it also does is going for that bulkier first cut, it delays the regrowth, it pushes back the second cut, and the overall yield of that field will be reduced as a consequence.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Some great tips and advice there for farmers.
Thank you, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Gordon for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan and thanks for listening.